The hermeneutics of suspicion. By this, people are usually referring to the thoughts of figures like Nietzsche, Marx, and Sigmund Freud, meaning a way of understanding human behaviour and texts that see them as sort of covers for real concerns, maybe unconscious concerns that the authors or actors are unaware of. So for Nietzsche, the will to power, he would see almost all human behaviour as an attempt to gain power. For Marx, of course, economic motives, economic interests, class interests. For Freud, unconscious desires, unconscious drives. And this concept or concepts have been picked up by what people call post-structuralist thinkers or postmodernist thinkers, perhaps. Figures like Michel Foucault, who after World War II developed a whole body of thought that saw social relations as being structured by the interests of power. Others might include Derrida, Deleuze, and so on. Now, what I found fascinating is that a certain hermeneutics of suspicion in these varied senses can be seen in the early modern era of European history, and in ways that seem to foreshadow these much more recent developments. So the French aristocrat La Rochefoucauld in the 17th century, his maxims became very well known, of which the key one, the sort of keystone of his whole work, is our virtues are most frequently but vices disguised. So La Rochefoucauld was fascinated by the idea that what he called self-love was in fact behind all acts of apparent benevolence or humility, merely attempts to gain an advantage over others in the longer run. This can be seen, of course, in the works of Thomas Hobbes, the English 17th century thinker whose Leviathan had such a powerful impact at the time. For Hobbes, interests of power were very much at the heart of all social relations. He does say that it's not, power for power's sake; it's power in order to live well. But he would see things in these terms too. This is something the poet Jonathan Swift would pick up on. He was very much influenced by La Rochefoucauld, and I'm going to explore Swift's thought in another video, because that sort of goes in other interesting directions. But these were real challenges at the time to those who wanted to maintain more traditional ideas of morality and ethics based on ideas of benevolence. And there were numerous reactions to them. But perhaps one of the most interesting is by the 18th century English clergyman Joseph Butler, who became very well known for his analogy, a work of theology that would go on to have a huge influence on John Henry Newman in the 19th century. But also he became well known for his 15 sermons preached at the Rolls Chapel. And these sermons were all about these problems of benevolence and self-interest. And they further build on a problematic that emerged in the early modern era of trying to enumerate the passions the different passions that lay within people that drove their behaviour, the priority of them, the um, the way in which they could be used for good or for evil. Alfred Hirschman, a much more recent historian, explored this in his classic The Passions and the Interests, arguing that the thought of this time was very concerned to identify economic interests that would somehow curb or tame the wilder passions. And in Hirschman's view, this encouraged the development of capitalism as being a sort of system of commercial interest that would restrain the wilder, more violent passions of men. But regardless, the way Butler responds to Rochefoucauld and Hobbes quite directly, because he mentions Hobbes by name and refers to the Rochefoucauld's maxims, is to say, well, okay, self-love may well be part of man's nature, but to just say that drives everything is really arbitrary. I mean, how do you know that? How can you demonstrate that? For Butler, rather than being driven by one reified principle, there's a number of things going on within men, including real acts of benevolence and compassion. And so people seem more like an assemblage of different things, which he almost uses that language of people being a collection of different things, not one drive. And in addition, he says, well, okay, you might be self-interested, but your actions might still work for the good of the wider society. And this sounds rather like someone like Adam Smith, the political economist, later in the 18th century, arguing that people might be pursuing their selfish, self-interested purposes, but somehow this will all work for a greater good. So what Butler does is to add a social angle. He would see La Rochefoucauld and Hobbes as being too much focused on individuals. He would want to say, well, we are what we are actually by our social relations and our responsibilities within those relations. And this, in some ways, itself foreshadows some post-structuralist concerns. It's almost a bit like the decentering of the subject, the attempt by people like Lacan and Deleuze and Foucault to move beyond the concept of the individual, the sort of humanist subject who makes ethical decisions, to see people as part of a bigger structure and picture, to question this idea of the self being a self-subsistent thing. Another strain of thought that would tie in with this is, of course, Louis Althusser, the structuralist Marxist of a similar time to Foucault, who said in a lecture, I am an Althusser effect of this structure, this capitalist system we live in. So in some ways, Butler's response to these lines of thought seems to anticipate quite recent trends in thought. But what I would question with him is, of course, that he just assumes a general benevolence, that we are in this sort of level playing field where men in general, society in general, receives our benevolent actions, and we have some responsibility to all. He, of course, is not thinking in terms of class interests, that people might be in different classes that have different interests and maybe exploit other classes. that would be something like the Marxist response, which would take something from Rochefoucauld and Hobbes's emphasis on the drive to power and self-interest and the ideological illusions that this can foster, but would place it within the context of social relations in a much more important or powerful way than those thinkers could. So it's worth looking into this. In some ways, these problems in the wake of what we might call capitalism have never left us. Maybe the whole dialectic of the individual and society is something of a kind of, not false one, but one that's never able to be simplified or overly simplified, because in some senses we live in a very atomized, individualistic society compared to previous modes of production, sure. But of course, we are subsumed into a bigger totality that homogenizes and regulates people's lives perhaps more than any other mode of production has done before, or at least to a greater extent, certainly a greater global extent. So I would encourage you, if you're interested in these things, to at least look up these figures and ponder how much further we've come in theory, and really how much further we have to go.